Marine Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, retired, had run out of road in a rusted Ford F-150 with 3 good tires and a quarter tank of gas. He'd come to the jagged edge of the Sierra Nevada mountains with the last of his disability pay, a duffel bag of worn fatigues, and Ghost, the German shepherd who had pulled him from the rubble of a collapsed schoolhouse in Sangan Valley a lifetime ago. He'd inherited a forgotten gold mine from a relative he never knew, a place to disappear into the quiet cold. But on the 3rd day, inside the mine's dark throat, Ghost froze, his scarred body rigid, and began to claw at a smooth concrete wall where no wall should be. Behind it waited a secret sealed for 40 years, a fortune that would drag Elias back into a war he thought he'd left behind and give him a reason to live again. Elias Thorne carried the war in the quiet spaces. It lived in the way he slept, on his side, facing the door of his truck cab, one hand resting on the worn grip of the pistol tucked under his seat. It was in the silence between him and Ghost, a language of shared trauma that needed no words. The dog, a graying Belgian Malinois with a slight limp and a web of fine white scars across his muzzle, had been his partner in the Corps. They had hunted men and bombs together through the dust and heat of Helmand Province, and when the world came down on top of Elias in a storm of concrete and rebar, it was Ghost's frantic digging and barking that had led the rescue team to his voice. The dog had dragged him from the wreckage then, and he had been grounding him ever since. When the tremors came, the memories that smelled of cordite and diesel and tasted of dust, Ghost would press his heavy head into Elias's lap, a solid, living anchor against the tide of the past. The mission that broke him wasn't the firefight, it was the aftermath. The silence, the faces of the children he couldn't save, the weight of the sky. Back home, the war had followed him into his marriage, a quiet, corrosive poison. His wife, Sarah, had tried, but she couldn't reach the man who had come home from that last deployment. The divorce was amicable but absolute, a surgical removal of a part of his life he could no longer feel. His daughter, Lily, was a voice on the phone, her pleas for him to get help becoming more distant with each passing year until they stopped altogether. The last time they spoke, she had called him a ghost, and he hadn't had the words to tell her she was right. He'd spent 2 years drifting, working odd jobs on ranches and fishing boats, always moving before anyone could get too close, before the questions started. The truck was his home, the dog his only family. Then the letter had found him, forwarded from the last VA hospital he'd checked into. A lawyer in a town he'd never heard of, Dust Devil Creek, California, informing him that a man named Silas Blackwood had died and left him his sole property, a 20-acre plot containing the defunct Morning Star mine. Silas was a second cousin, a name he vaguely remembered his mother mentioning once, a Vietnam vet, another ghost. For Elias, it wasn't an inheritance. It was a final destination, a place to stop running, to let the silence take him completely. He pointed the Ford east, toward the mountains, with just enough money for gas and a week's worth of dog food, driving toward the last quiet place on his map. The town of Dust Devil Creek was little more than a wide spot in a 2-lane road, clinging to the side of a mountain like a stubborn patch of lichen. The lawyer's office was above the general store, the wooden stairs groaning under Elias's weight. Arthur Vance was a man made of dust and paper, his suit hanging loose on his thin frame. He peered at Elias over a pair of crooked spectacles. "You're Thorne," he said, not a question. "You have his eyes." He explained that Silas Blackwood had no other living kin. The deed to the Morning Star mine was his, free and clear, pending the payment of 3 years of back taxes. $412. It was nearly everything Elias had left. Silas was a quiet man, Vance said, stamping the papers with a heavy, final thud. Came back from the war and never really left these mountains. Kept to himself. Elias watched the old lawyer, clocked the slight hesitation in his voice, the way his eyes didn't quite meet his own. It was a tell he'd learned long ago. "Something else?" Elias asked, his voice flat. Vance sighed, a dry rustle of air. After Silas passed, a man came asking about the property. Marcus Thorne. No relation, I assume. Big developer from down the valley, owns half the county. Said he wanted to build a resort, offered a fair price. But Silas would never sell. Told him to go to hell more than once. The lawyer pushed the key to the gate across the desk. Just thought you should know. People have been interested in that land before. The drive up to the mine was another 10 miles of winding dirt track that clawed its way higher into the pines. The air grew thin and cold. The gate was heavy iron, chained and padlocked. Beyond it, a small, dilapidated cabin stood in a clearing, its porch sagging. The mine entrance was a dark wound in the hillside beside it. Elias walked the property line, Ghost trotting silently at his heel. He saw the rot, the rust, the years of neglect. But he also saw the bones of the place. The cabin was built of solid, hand-hewn logs on a stone foundation. The mine timbers at the entrance were thick and looked sound. It was a defensible position. He ran a hand over the rough wood of the cabin wall. It was a place built to endure, a place to make a final stand or a new beginning. He didn't know which it would be, and at that moment he wasn't sure he cared. He just knew he was done running. That night, a deep, profound silence settled over the mountain, broken only by the wind in the pines. For the first time in years, Elias slept through the night without the ghosts of Sangan visiting his dreams. The first days were a ritual of reclamation. Elias worked from sunup to sundown, the physical labor a welcome anesthetic for his mind. He patched the leaking roof of the cabin with scavenged tin, cleared the overgrown brush from around the foundation, and reinforced the sagging porch. He found an old wood-burning stove inside, rusted but intact, and spent an afternoon cleaning it out, the scent of soot and old fires filling the small space. Ghost was his shadow, lying in a patch of sun while Elias worked, his head up, ears twitching at every sound from the forest. But the dog was unsettled. He paced the perimeter of the cabin restlessly, a low grumble in his chest. Elias wrote it off as the new territory, the scent of coyote and bear in the air. On the third morning, Elias decided to inspect the mine itself. He took a heavy flashlight from his truck, checked the batteries, and clicked it on. The beam cut a clean circle in the darkness of the entrance. "Stay," he commanded Ghost, but the dog whined and pushed past him, unwilling to let him go in alone. The air inside was cold and still, smelling of damp earth and stone. The main tunnel went straight back into the mountain, the walls rough-hewn granite, the floor packed earth. About 50 yards in, the tunnel forked, and there, Ghost froze. His body went rigid, a statue of muscle and fur. His hackles rose along his spine, and a growl, deep and resonant, vibrated in his chest. It was a sound Elias hadn't heard since their last tour, the sound the dog made when he scented explosives just beneath the surface. Ghost's attention was fixed on a section of the left-hand wall. It was different from the surrounding rock. A patch of concrete, roughly 10 feet square, had been troweled over the granite. It was smoother, a pale gray against the dark, mottled stone. "What is it, boy?" Elias murmured, placing a hand on the dog's back. Ghost ignored him. He crept forward, sniffing at the base of the concrete, and then began to paw at it, his claws scraping uselessly against the hard surface. He let out a sharp, demanding bark that echoed down the tunnel. Elias tried to pull him away. "Easy, boy. It's just a wall, probably shoring up a weak spot." But Ghost would not be moved. He planted his feet, his entire being focused on that one spot. He dug and barked, a frantic, insistent rhythm that grated on Elias's nerves. The dog's certainty was absolute, a thing so pure and powerful it began to erode Elias's own skepticism. He trusted the dog's instincts more than he trusted most people. Ghost had saved his life more than once by being right when every human sense was wrong. With a sigh of resignation, Elias walked to the wall and knocked his knuckles against the concrete. The sound was a dull, solid thud. He knocked again, higher up, thud. Then, near the center, the sound changed. It was a flat, hollow thump, an emptiness on the other side. Elias stared at the wall, the hollow sound echoing in the silence of the mine. Ghost sat at his feet, panting softly, his eyes fixed on the concrete as if he could see through it. The dog had found something. Now it was up to him to uncover it. He returned to the dilapidated shed next to the cabin, the flashlight beam dancing over piles of rusted junk. In the back corner, under a rotten canvas tarp, he found Silas Blackwood's tools. They were old but well made. A 10-pound sledgehammer with a worn hickory handle, a heavy-duty pickaxe, and a long steel pry bar. He carried them back into the mine, the weight of the steel feeling solid and purposeful in his hands. He started with the sledgehammer, swinging it in a steady, powerful arc. The first blow sent a web of hairline cracks across the concrete surface. The second blew out a chunk the size of his fist. The work was brutal, punishing. Dust filled the air, coating his throat and stinging his eyes. Sweat soaked through his shirt, despite the chill in the tunnel. Ghost stayed back near the entrance, whining softly but obeying Elias's command to stay clear. Hour after hour, Elias hammered and pried, breaking the concrete away piece by piece. It was thicker than he expected, nearly a foot deep and reinforced with a grid of rusted rebar. Silas hadn't just sealed this space, he had entombed it. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal and shattering stone, a large section of the wall gave way, falling inward with a heavy crash. Elias shone his light into the opening. It revealed a small, man-made chamber, no bigger than a closet, carved directly out of the granite. And inside, stacked neatly on the floor, were 5 military-grade ammo cans. He set the tools aside and squeezed through the opening. The air in the chamber was stale, dead. He knelt and wiped the dust off the nearest can. He worked the latch, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. The lid popped open with a hiss of compressed air. He aimed the flashlight inside. His breath caught. It was filled to the brim with coarse gold dust and dozens of small, rough nuggets that glittered like captured stars. He opened the next can, and the next. More gold. The 4th can was different. It was packed with bundles of cash, old bills bound with rubber bands that had gone brittle with age. 10s, 20s, 50s. It had to be hundreds of thousands of dollars. The last can was the lightest. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed cotton, was a single leather-bound journal. Elias lifted it out. The leather was dry and cracked, the pages stiff. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise. My name is Silas Blackwood. If you are reading this, I am likely dead, and you have found what I spent my life guarding. Elias sat on the floor of the dark, silent chamber and began to read. Silas wrote of his own war, of the jungles of Vietnam, of the ghosts he brought home. He wrote that the gold wasn't from the mine. It was the payload from an armored car robbery in 1978, stolen by his former commanding officer and the man's partner. Silas had been forced to help them hide it. The CO had been killed in a shootout years later, but his partner had gotten away clean. Silas had spent the next 40 years watching over the cash, waiting, knowing the partner's family would never stop looking for it. The journal was a warning. This isn't a fortune, Silas wrote. It's a war passed down. The partner's name was Alistair Thorne. His son Marcus is a powerful man in this valley now. He's patient. He's been waiting for me to die. He will come looking. Do not trust him. Do not trust anyone with that name." Elias closed the journal, the name hitting him like a physical blow. Marcus Thorne, the developer the lawyer had warned him about. The discovery was not an inheritance. It was a trapdoor, and he had just fallen through it. Elias moved the ammo cans to the cabin under the cover of darkness, hiding them beneath a loose floorboard in the corner. He kept the journal with him, tucked into his jacket. The knowledge of what he'd found, and the danger it carried, settled over him like a second skin. His senses, dulled by years of civilian life, sharpened again. He was back on watch. He sat on the porch for 2 days, cleaning his pistol, observing the road, listening to the sounds of the forest. Ghost lay at his feet, equally alert, his ears swiveling to track the flight of a distant hawk, the rustle of a squirrel in the leaves. On the third morning, he saw the plume of dust from the valley below long before he heard the engine. A vehicle was coming up the mountain, moving slowly but steadily. Elias moved inside the cabin, positioning himself by the window where he could see the approach without being seen. Ghost stood beside him, a low rumble starting in his chest. A pristine black SUV, the kind that cost more than Elias had made in the last 5 years, pulled into the clearing and stopped. The engine went silent. A man in a tailored suit and polished leather shoes stepped out. He was tall, mid-40s, with a smile that was too bright, too practiced. Marcus Thorne. He walked toward the cabin with an easy confidence, as if he owned the place already. "Hello?" he called out. "Anyone home?" Elias stepped onto the porch, letting the screen door slam shut behind him. He didn't say anything. Ghost moved to stand between them, his body language clear and unequivocal. "Do not come closer." Thorne's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered to the dog. "That's quite a guard dog you've got there," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I was sorry to hear about Silas. He was a fixture in these parts." Elias remained silent, letting Thorne do the talking, letting him reveal himself. "I'm a developer," Thorne continued, gesturing vaguely toward the valley. "I've been trying to acquire this parcel for years. I have a vision for a private, high-end retreat. I was prepared to make Silas a very generous offer. I'd like to extend that same offer to you. Say, $200,000, cash, for this rundown shack and a played-out mine." The offer was absurdly high. It was a test, a lure. Elias thought of Silas's journal, of the stolen gold. This wasn't about a resort. It was about what was hidden under the floorboards a few feet from where he stood. He looked at Thorne's expensive shoes and noticed they were caked with a reddish-brown mud around the soles, the same color as the dirt farther up the mountain pass. It hadn't rained in a week. Thorne had already been up here, on foot, scouting. His eyes weren't looking at the cabin as a developer would. They were scanning, assessing, looking for disturbed earth, new activity, a sign that the long-lost prize had been found. "Not for sale," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. Thorne's smile finally tightened at the edges. The mask slipped for just a second, revealing a flash of cold anger in his eyes. "That's a mistake," he said softly. "A man in your position, living out of a truck, should think carefully about walking away from that kind of money." He turned and walked back to his SUV without another word. As the vehicle disappeared back down the mountain, Elias knew the first move had been made. The next one would not be a conversation. That night, he did a quiet patrol of his perimeter. He found what he was looking for at the main gate. The heavy-duty chain he had secured with his own padlock had been cut. The link was sliced clean through, the metal shining in the moonlight. It had been repaired with a small, new-looking bolt, a clumsy attempt to hide the intrusion. Someone had been inside his wire before Thorne ever showed up. They were already here. The neatly severed chain was a message. We can get to you anytime we want. The quiet on the mountain was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with surveillance. Elias knew he couldn't just sit and wait for the next move. He needed information, context. He needed to understand the enemy. He drove the Ford into Dust Devil Creek the next morning, Ghost sitting watchful in the passenger seat. He parked across from the general store and watched the town for a full hour, getting the rhythm of it, noting the faces, the cars that passed. He saw a man in a dusty pickup truck, one he'd noticed parked at a turnout on the mountain road the day before, watching him from the corner of his eye. Thorne had eyes everywhere. Elias went to the town's small library, a single room attached to the county clerk's office. A woman with kind eyes and graying hair sat behind the main desk. A small plaque read, "Sarah Jenkins, Town Historian." "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for information," Elias said, keeping his voice low, "on a man named Silas Blackwood and the Thorne family." Sarah's friendly expression became guarded. She looked him over, taking in his military-style haircut, the worn fatigue jacket, the calm watchfulness in his eyes. "You're the one who took over Silas's place," she said. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded. "He was a relative. My grandfather was Silas's only friend," she said, her voice softening. "He was the town doctor. Said Silas was a good man, but haunted. Always said he wasn't mining for gold up there. He was guarding something." She turned to an old microfiche machine in the corner. "The Thornes, they've been buying up land on that mountain for 30 years, boxing Silas in. Marcus inherited his father's ambition and none of his charm. He owns the sheriff, the county commissioner, most everything around here." She pulled up old property records, showing him a map. The Morning Star Mine was an island in a sea of Thorne-owned property. Then she found the newspaper clippings about Silas's death a few months prior. The official report was an accident. He'd fallen from a ledge while prospecting. "My grandfather never believed it," Sarah said quietly. "Silas was a Marine. He knew that mountain better than anyone. He didn't just fall." Elias's hand went to the journal in his jacket. He remembered the last line he'd read before Thorne's visit. "The proof is with the water, where the old assay maps lie." "Assay maps," he said. "The original surveys for the mines, where would they be?" Sarah's eyes lit with understanding. "The old county records hall. It was in the basement of the courthouse. There was a big flood in '92. The whole basement was submerged. They moved everything to the new building, but they left the condemned archives sealed off. They said everything down there was ruined. The proof. Forged deeds, falsified maps. The paper trail that would expose the Thorne family's long con." As Elias thanked her and turned to leave, he saw the man from the pickup truck standing across the street, talking on a cell phone, his eyes locked on the library door. The net was tightening. He wasn't just being watched anymore. He was being hunted. He knew then that he would have to go into the water to find the truth, and that Thorne would do anything to stop him. The threat was no longer a matter of if, but when. Elias returned to the cabin not as a homesteader, but as a soldier preparing a defensive position. The lessons of Sangun, of Fallujah, of a dozen unnamed outposts came back to him with stark clarity. He spent the day fortifying his small piece of the mountain. He felled 2 pines and dragged them across the narrow access road a quarter-mile down from his gate, creating a natural choke point. He dug a shallow trench behind a rock outcropping that gave him a clear field of fire covering the approach to the cabin. He rigged simple alarms using tin cans and fishing line at the perimeter of the clearing. He wasn't building a fortress, just an early warning system. He was buying himself time. The attack came 2 nights later. A storm had rolled in, blanketing the mountain in thick fog and a cold, driving rain that deadened all sound. It was perfect weather for an assault. Ghost gave him the first warning, a low growl from the foot of the bed where he slept. Elias was instantly awake, his pistol in his hand. He moved to the window and peered into the soupy darkness. Nothing. Then he heard it, the soft clink of metal on rock. One of his alarms. They were inside his perimeter. He moved to the back of the cabin, Ghost a silent shadow at his heels. He saw a flicker of orange light against the log wall near the woodshed. They were trying to set a fire, to flush him out, to create chaos and cover their real objective, the mine. He slipped out the back door and melted into the trees, the cold rain plastering his hair to his scalp. He circled around, moving with a silence born of years of practice. He saw two of them, big men, dressed in black, moving with sloppy confidence. One was splashing gasoline on the woodshed, while the other stood guard, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. Elias waited for his moment. When the first man pulled out a lighter, Elias moved. He closed the distance in 3 silent strides, bringing the butt of his pistol down hard on the base of the man's skull. He went down without a sound. The second man heard the muffled thump and turned, raising his shotgun. He wasn't fast enough. Elias was already on him. But as they struggled, the man pulled a long hunting knife. Ghost, seeing the threat to Elias, launched himself from the darkness. He hit the man in the chest, all teeth and fury, driving him to the ground. The man screamed, a raw sound of terror and pain, and flailed wildly with the knife. The blade caught Ghost high on the shoulder, a deep, slashing cut. The dog yelped, a sharp cry of pain, but didn't release his hold. That sound, the sound of his dog in pain, broke something in Elias. The cold, controlled soldier vanished, replaced by a cold, efficient rage. He put an end to the fight. It was over in seconds. He dragged the 2 unconscious men into the shed, bound their hands and feet with baling wire, and then turned his full attention to Ghost. He carried the dog, whimpering and bleeding, back into the cabin. He laid him gently on his bedroll and cleaned the wound as best he could with his limited supplies. The cut was deep, down to the muscle. Ghost licked his hand, his tail giving a weak thump against the floorboards. Seeing his partner, his only family, bleeding for him on the floor of this cabin, was the lowest Elias had felt since the day he'd been pulled from the rubble. He found a 2-way radio on one of the captured men. He keyed the mic. "Your men failed," he said, his voice flat and dead. "Send your boss, or send more men. I'll be waiting." A voice crackled back, a voice he didn't recognize. "Sheriff's Department. We have a report of a disturbance at your location." Elias went cold. It wasn't the sheriff. It was a lie. Thorne didn't just own the county, he owned the law. He was completely, utterly alone. He knew he had only one play left. He couldn't trust the law, and he couldn't fight a private army forever. He had to change the game. He had to bring in a force that Thorne couldn't buy or intimidate. He spent the next hour carefully stitching Ghost's wound with a needle and fishing line from his survival kit, the dog trusting him completely, only flinching when the needle pierced his skin. The animal's quiet courage solidified Elias's resolve. He owed it to Ghost and to Silas to see this through. He used the radio again, but this time he keyed in a different frequency, one he knew Sarah Jenkins would be monitoring, the local emergency services band. "Sarah, this is Elias Thorne," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need you to make that call, the one your grandfather told you about. Tell them everything. Tell them about the mine, the journal, the Thorne family. Tell them there are 2 of Thorne's men here, and the local sheriff is compromised. Tell them to come now." He didn't know if she heard him, if she was even listening. It was a shot in the dark. While he waited, he went to work. He loaded the 2 groggy, bound men into the back of their own truck. He drove them down the mountain, not to the sheriff's office, but to the grand, wrought-iron gates of Marcus Thorne's sprawling estate. He left them on the manicured lawn for the morning security patrol to find. On the chest of one of the men, he placed a single, heavy gold nugget from Silas's stash. In the other man's hand, he tucked a single page torn from Silas's journal, the page that detailed Alistair Thorne's betrayal and the original robbery. It was a declaration. The secret was out. The sun was just beginning to touch the highest peaks when he heard the distinct sound of helicopters. Not the slow, heavy beat of a local news chopper, but the fast, chopping rhythm of federal aircraft. 2 black helicopters descended from the sky, landing in the clearing in a whirlwind of pine needles and dust. Men in tactical gear, with FBI and BLM stenciled on their vests, poured out. They were led by a stern-faced woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Special Agent Diaz. Sarah had come through. Diaz had been building a case against the Thorne family for years, suspecting them of everything from land fraud to money laundering. But she never had the evidence to make it stick. Elias gave her everything. He led her into the mine, showed her the hidden chamber, and handed her Silas Blackwood's journal. He gave her the gold, the cash, and most importantly, the location of the flooded archives. With federal warrants, Diaz's team pumped the water from the courthouse basement and recovered the old assay maps and property deeds. The documents, preserved in the cold, still water, were the final nail in the coffin. They proved, unequivocally, that the Thorne family had systematically forged documents for decades to illegally seize land, Silas Blackwood's being the final piece of their puzzle. Marcus Thorne was arrested that afternoon at his estate, trying to flee the country. The corrupt sheriff and a half-dozen of his deputies were taken into custody an hour later. The Thorne empire, built on a 40-year-old crime, crumbled in a single day. In the aftermath, Elias stood at the entrance to the Morning Star mine, the mountain air feeling cleaner, lighter. The gold and cash were entered into evidence, but a portion was eventually released to him as the legal heir. He didn't keep it. He used every dollar to establish the Silas Blackwood Foundation, a trust dedicated to creating a retreat on that very mountain, a place for veterans who, like Silas and himself, were struggling to find their way home from the war. He stood on the porch of the cabin, now repaired and solid, and made a phone call he'd been putting off for 2 years. "Lily," he said, when his daughter answered. "It's Dad. I need to tell you a story." For the first time, he told her everything. About Sangan, about his ghosts, about the mine, about Silas. He didn't make excuses. He just told her the truth. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then her voice, thick with emotion, said, "I'll be on the next flight." A week later, he sat on that same porch, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of orange and purple. Ghost, his shoulder healing cleanly, rested his head on Elias's knee. His daughter Lily sat beside him, her hand resting on his. What had started as a place to disappear, a place to let the silence finally win, had become the one place on earth that had saved him. The dog, the dead man's words, and the quiet courage of a stranger had given him back a life he thought he had lost forever. He had inherited a war, and in fighting it, he had finally found his peace.